just too wide, too dense, too widespread. There's so much knowledge, and every day we learn so many things new, even without realizing. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew some of the techniques that would help us in easily grasping some of the difficult concepts and later on help us in recalling as well? This is the topic of my today's talk, learning how to learn. Basically, I've consolidated a list of techniques that help you in learning more effectively. Not only learning, recalling as well. So I'll go over all of these techniques in my today's presentation. Learning is an essential part of life. If you want to grow, it's a continuous process. It never stops. Don't think that now you have cleared that tough exam, or now you're an engineer, or now you're finally cleared, you became a doctor, that it's going to stop now. It's a continuous process. It never stops. And the stuff that you're trying to learn is equally important as the techniques that you use to learn those things. If you deploy the right techniques, then you will save both time as well as effort. Some of my friends, they just go over some of the difficult concepts so easily, and when I ask them, how did you manage to do that so quickly? The response that I get is, I just do it. So that's not good enough a response for me. But if I look deeper, they are intrinsically using some of the techniques that I'll go over without even knowing it. And we all might be using one or the other technique that I'll discuss going forward. Another concept to keep in mind is neuroplasticity. This concept is basically, don't think that if now you're not able to solve the problem, you'll not be able to solve it in the future as well. Our brain continuously remaps, revise, and as we learn new stuff, new memories, new connections keep on forming. So it is possible to increase your IQ. Alright, we move to the next slide. So the inspiration for these slides is coming from the Coursera course that I recently took. I have a link to it over here. It's by the same name, Learning How to Learn. It's taught by Dr. Barbara and Dr. Terence. And as I mentioned already, some of this you might already be doing, but some of it you might find actually interesting and very helpful. And this course, as well as this presentation, all it does is all these wide spread out things, it brings under a common umbrella. So it gives a well-defined structure. I highly encourage anyone who wants to take this course. It's a self-paced course on Coursera, 4-week course. So it would be very encouraging for you if you are trying to learn something new. Okay, next slide. So before we look at the techniques themselves, I'll just give you a quick understanding of how the brain works. So this is just a very, very rough analogy, and the brain and the computer are not exactly alike. The computer is digital, either it's sleeping or not sleeping. But a human brain, it might be sleeping, you might be feeling more sleepy, less sleepy, you might be already on the bed and not sleeping. So there are all those states. But very, very roughly, I've tried to show you by these pictures the analogy between the computer and the human brain. We mainly have two components, the RAM and the hard disk. Now RAM is random access memory, it's like a workspace area. So whatever you are currently working on is the RAM. And wherever the permanent memories lie is the hard disk. Later on, you retrieve from the hard disk all those memories and bring them into the RAM. So that's just a very, very rough understanding. And commits must happen from whatever you were working on currently to the main hard disk, so that later on you can bring it back. So, and there is the importance of sleep for that process to happen effectively. I'll cover that as well. Alright, next. So these are the techniques themselves. We have the focus versus diffuse mode, analogies, mind maps, the importance of practice, importance of exercise, sleep, meditation, and the use of willpower for getting that initial push. I'll be covering each of them in quite some detail with examples in the coming slides. Alright, so the first technique is focus versus diffuse mode. Let's look at the picture on the left. So what I've done is I've replaced the neurons in the human brain with a pinball game. So what the focus mode says is, if you're trying to solve something familiar, then your thought travels and goes through these rubber bumpers or the neurons, and once you have completed this circuit, you will have a solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. Basically, this was something that you already knew. The thought just went, followed the path, and you had a solution. But what happens when you are given something new? You are trying to work on a problem that you have never looked at before. For that, you would have the solution had these connections been formed. They are less red because it shows they are not yet formed permanently. So, but if you are always in the focus mode, the thought will not be able to travel. It will always keep on bumping around these rubber bumpers. That's when we have the diffuse mode. The diffuse mode is kind of like a zoomed out or a broader picture view of things. So in zoomed out mode or diffuse mode, what happens is basically you just let the thought travel around. You let the new connections form, and you don't just get bogged down in the problem. And at the end of the diffuse mode, you will probably start forming some connections that are necessary for solving this problem. And don't think that one mode is better than the other. You continuously need to switch back and forth between both the modes, and you cannot be in both modes at the same time. The research has shown that. So both modes have their own importance. So on the next slide, I have some examples. So the famous example of this scientist, August Hercule, who imagined the structure of benzene while dreaming. So he was working on this problem very, very hard, but he couldn't come up with the structure of benzene. And when he went to sleep, he just imagined a snake eating its own tail. So that's how, after he woke up, he just had the structure of benzene envisioned. He just envisioned it like that. So this is a perfect example of diffuse mode. He couldn't get it right when he was solely focusing on the thing, but he got it right when he allowed the thought to just randomly go about. So next thing is, say you are trying to solve something like integral calculus. You need to learn certain roots. You need to have some formulations, your tricks, mathematical tricks, and then whenever you are given a problem, you just follow that familiar pattern and you will come up with a solution. So that's an example of focus mode. It has its own importance. The last thing that I have on this slide is the commonly used two methodologies in programming. One is the top-down and other one is the bottom-up. So in bottom-up, what you do is you just focus on one module and then you move on to the next, then you start building the big picture. But in top-down, which I personally prefer, you just first have an algorithmic flow, that this is the problem and this is what all I need to do to come at the solution. And then in each individual mode of the module, then you start in focusing on the modules. So this is top-down, bottom-up, or focus versus diffuse mode. Alright. So next technique that we have are analogies and mind maps. So you always, if you are trying to understand something very, very difficult, if you try to relate what you find as difficult to things that you already know, then it becomes much, much easier. So the example I have for analogies and mind maps are, you can equate the flow of current through the wire as water flowing through a pipe. So how wide the pipe is can be equated to the resistance of the wire and so on and so forth. So basically I'm just drawing analogies and trying to relate one thing that I already understand, which is the flow of water, to something that I'm trying to understand for the first time, the flow of current. Another example on the similar lines is the Merchant of Venice example. So when this play was ongoing in our class, I couldn't understand the story. I couldn't follow. The character names were simply much more complex. I didn't know who was what and how the story was proceeding. But the moment my teacher substituted the character names with famous actors, I just had the whole flow of the story. It was very easy to grasp and I could see the whole story from the top view. So this is just another example of how analogies and mind maps work. Next slide. So on similar lines, one of the things that I personally do is, if you're trying to remember multiple things, right, and they are kind of related, then you don't need to remember the whole bunch. You just remember a slice of that, and when you are asked what was the other value, just flip the value that you remembered and you get to the other values. So the example of this would be in chemistry, right? You know that cation is positive and cathode is negative. If you just remember this much, you don't need to remember what anion and anode is if you're learning for the first time, right? When you're asked what is the charge of anion and anode, you just flip the charge of cation and cathode. So you just remember one thing. Had you tried to remember these 4 values separately, there's a possibility that during the exam you might goof up and mix up, this is positive, this is negative. But if you just focus on the 2, then the other 2 you can get by flipping the values. That's another technique. Mnemonic maps. So periodic table, right? Every one of us had to go through this when we took chemistry at some point of our studies. But if you try to remember the periodic table like hydrogen, helium, lithium, boron, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So instead, what you do is, if you have the symbols, so I do this personally, I try to remember it like ha, he, li, bi, ba, ka, no, fa, ni, like the symbols, right? I turn it into a map, and then I can expand H hydrogen later on. So it makes it easier, and I was able to learn at least 30% of the table through this technique. Memory palace is another technique. It's kind of like a visual notepad. So what you do in this technique is you basically imagine yourself in a familiar situation. So for example, you could be at your house. Then the sofa, instead of the sofa, you imagine a big loaf of bread. Instead of the refrigerator, you envision a big bottle of milk. Instead of the round table, you imagine eggs falling down or whatever imagery you want to draw. And that's how you can remember your grocery list. So Memory Palace is kind of a visual notepad, and it builds creativity as well. Next slide. So we all know the importance of practice, but practice not only makes things permanent, but it should be spaced just right. So imagine this bodybuilder in the right bottom of the slide. Had he tried to lift this heavy weight at the very day of the competition, it would have been very, very difficult. But if he had been practicing day by day, slowly his muscles would be developing very easily. So these muscles can be equated to the neurons, the connections that we form in our brain when we are trying to learn something. If we try to solve problems again and again without looking at the solution, then those connections become stronger as his muscles are. So, and it's important to note that abstract things need more practice if you're trying to bring them into reality. So I'm just highlighting the importance of practice and spacing it just right. So on the next slide, I have a little bit of visual. So the picture on the right is what your neural connection will look like if you cram everything at once. And on the left is if you do a little by little every day, is you'll have a much more easier time remembering, forming new memories and recalling stuff later on. So this was importance of spaced practice. On the next slide, so we all know the importance of exercise. We need to be physically fit. The blood needs to pump to various organs. But equally important is sleep. During sleep, the memories are committed from the RAM area, shown on the first slide, to the hard disk area. So sleep is equally important, and not only memories are committed, the waste that is generated in the neurons during the day's activities also gets recycled during the sleep. If you don't get a proper night's sleep, you will lose focus and you will feel groggy the whole day, the whole next day. Meditation is another important technique. So it helps you with the response. It basically gives you another response besides just panicking. So, and you must notice that you must have a good amount of balance, because excess of everything is bad. So on the next slide, I have the importance of willpower for the initial push. Whenever you're trying to learn something new, procrastination is going to be a major issue. So you can use the Pomodoro technique. What you do in this technique is basically you just set a timer and you don't get up from that problem until that timer goes off. When that goes off, you take a short 3 to 5 minute break and repeat this whole process 4 to 5 times, and then you can take a longer break, go for an exercise or a hike. Alright, so next slide. I just gave a brief summary of all that we have looked at. We have the focus versus diffuse mode, analogies, mind maps, practicing, the importance of practice, and staying fit, and how you can beat procrastination with willpower. So learning can be fun if you use these techniques, and I hope the next time you're trying to learn something difficult, you will deploy some of these techniques. Thank you.